Thank y'all so very much. It's such an honor to be here with you tonight. I applaud you for coming out in this weather. Wow. Um, it's like a balmy 47 degrees here right now. And the reason I didn't get on the call earlier is because I was putting one more load of laundry in the dryer, thinking I had enough time because you have a 9-year-old in your world, there's always laundry. So I looked at the time and I thought, I think I can make it. So I'm really glad to be with y'all tonight. It's really an honor to have a chance to talk about this special place that has come to mean so much to me personally and to the world. And what my hope is that as we go through tonight, you'll feel free to ask questions, difficult questions, challenging questions. I'm here for all of it. And we'll sort it out together. I don't always have all of the answers, but I try. And when I don't have them, I go find them. But I will say that McLeod is a place that you won't forget. It's just something about walking that ground where people actually lived and loved and died and suffered. It changes people in profound ways. And my hope is that you'll be able to come there. Those of you who haven't had a chance to visit, you'll be able to come to Charleston and spend time with us. But tonight will serve sort of as the opening. And we'll talk a little bit about McLeod and the lessons of McLeod tonight. And then we're going to have another meeting where we'll follow up on that. So with that being said, let us tackle the McLeod story, which we're calling racial reconciliation. Before we begin, are there any questions? Good?
Good.
All right, let's get started. Next slide. And thank you for turning the pages.
Yeah, whoops, too far.
McLeod Plantation is one of two places in the country that looks exclusively at the issue of slavery. The other, as I mentioned here, is Whitney in Louisiana. Has anyone been, by show of hands? Has anyone ever heard of Whitney? Okay, so please put that on your places to know about list. They are closed right now due to the impact of Hurricane Ida, but we're standing with them in solidarity, hoping that they'll be able to reopen. We opened within several months of each other in 2015, so we definitely carry this torch together. For more information about McLeod, we fall under the auspices of Charleston County Parks and Recreation Commission, which was a specially designated area going all the way back to 1968 to open up parks and make them more accessible. So we are unusual in that we fall under the auspices of County Parks and Rec. And I put our website if you'd like to learn more about that structure. And our website is actually underneath there. So if you want to follow up with a little bit more about McLeod, that's the website. We are open Tuesday through Sunday from 9 to 4. And it is incredibly busy even now. I was talking to my colleagues earlier. There was like a 40 people in one tour group today on a Sunday afternoon in 40-degree weather. So we're trying to figure out where are these folks coming from so early. So we're expecting to be busy. As soon as the weather hits 70, 60, 65, 70, it's going to be over for us. So just so you know where we are on James Island, which if you've been to Charleston, you go the downtown peninsula, you go over the bridge and you make a left and we sit right there. We're at an incredibly beautiful juncture of Charleston. So just if you ever get a trip there, please stop by and see us. Next. It's important to us that you know about the International Sites of Consciousness. It's a network of institutions that have put their heart not only into preserving history, but making sure that we leave things better for those who will follow. If you're not familiar, I've put their website down so that you can become familiar with the Sites of Consciousness and the amazing work that they do. We are an affiliate member. We do have training with them. We connect with them. They are an important part of who we are. Last year, or I should say the year before, in the run up to the presidential election, we had some difficult moments at McLeod. There were a number of people who came very upset, wearing their feelings on their sleeve. And it was a little bit nerve wracking. So we turned to the International Sites of Consciousness, the coalition, for training on how to diffuse situations and how to, how should I say, learn how to embrace the challenge, but don't shun the challenger. And they do amazing work around the world for those of you who may not be familiar with them. I want to give you just a teeny bit of background about McLeod, because it is very significant how old this place really is. And, you know, if you know a little bit about Charleston, you may be familiar with Charlestown Landing and 1670. Well, we are finding out that the first map of James Island, which at that time was called Boone Isle, goes back about 25 years after. So McLeod historically is far more significant than we have touched on in the past. And I'm looking forward to us delving into its roots, which go substantially further than we realized, particularly around, if you note that first entry, as much as 8,000 years ago, our First Nation family was there. And there are materials, there are shards, there is pottery, there are things that they left in that space. And one of my goals in coming on board is to further delve into our Native American family to find out who they were and what they left and what continuing lessons we can learn from them. David Davis was one of the first owners of the property at McLeod. And you'll notice here that these names, interestingly enough, they're all connected by marriage. So pro tip number one, when you establish dynasties and things of this sort, particularly in the South, people tended to marry other family members. They married cousins, they married close kin so that they could keep the property. From the Davises all the way up to the Lightwoods was one family that kept marrying each other. So that way that the land stayed intact. That is a very unique marking of plantation systems in the South. Before we go, I do want to mention to you that one of these owners was a man by the name of Lightwood, Edward Lightwood. Please make a note of him, those of you who are into ancestry. Edward Lightwood was a slaver. We have found him in slavevoyages.org, which is a massive database that shows you in real time what it looked like for those ships to travel back and forth. It is an extraordinary piece of work. And I tell you, with the day that I found his name, my heart stopped because it just hit home to me. This man was bringing people who walked the ground that I now walk on today. He was extraordinarily wealthy. He had all of the money that the McLeods wished they had. Not that they were hungry, don't get me wrong, but this man set a new standard in wealth in Charleston. The people who eventually would become enslaved at McLeod came from the area of Africa. If you could visualize the map of West Africa in particular, from Senegal to the north, all the way down to Angola, even going into the Congo. And even today, they remember those journeys. They remember what the griots of the village told them about family members who were taken away. That heritage is still very much intact. The people who got off those boats and who settled in Charleston would go on to create a culture called the Gullah Geechee culture. Gullah refers to language. So all of those Africans who got off those slave ships, they were not speaking the King's English, right? That would come much later. They were speaking their mother tongues, Ooh and Tree and Fonte and Wolof and Nereri and Mandinka. All of those languages would end up in a big pot to become America's small C Creole, the Gullah language. It's still spoken today. I don't speak it. I'm a native Charlestonian, but I grew up in Philadelphia. But if you go to the market downtown in Charleston, you'll hear it. You'll hear those sweet mothers who are weaving those baskets. You'll hear it in the accent. You'll hear it in the restaurants. You'll hear it in the hotels. It's still very, very, very much alive. Geechee refers to the people. So it can mean you're either from South Carolina or from Georgia. But the whole corridor, which I've outlined for you here, is now federally recognized space. Thank you, Congressman James Clyburn. And if you go to the Gullah Geechee Corridor website, you will find amazing things about the culture, the language, things to do along the corridor. They have a new director, a wonderful lady named Victoria Small. She's a wonderful friend of ours. So I want you to put this in your interesting tabs. You know, we're always checking our phones and Googling things, right? So when things pop up about Gullah Geechee, then you'll begin to get a flood of info about this very special part of the country. Geechee people are all over America, but the Gullah communities are still largely along the coast, what you see here, and they extend all the way down to Jacksonville, Florida. So when you come this way, not only can you go to Charleston, go south to Beaufort, go south to Edisto, go to Hilton Head, and you'll be experiencing the magic of what we call the Gullah Geechee cultural heritage. The place that we are focusing on today was once 1,700 plus acres. If you can envision, this dark blue outline shows you how large McLeod Plantation was. Now, let me be clear. This place did not start becoming McLeod Plantation until modern times. Back in the day, it was just where the McLeods were. It was the McLeod place. But all of this was theirs. So it extended, if you see there, that's the Ashley River, which takes you right to the ocean. You can't get any closer. And right across the way is downtown Charleston. That's how close the McLeods were. If you go the other direction, the plantation is almost bordered by it's called Ellis Creek, which divides James Island in half. So water is a constant. And I want you to embrace that for just a moment, because not only was the water critical for the McLeod family, they had to get their goods and services to market. It was critical for the enslaved. If you were going to escape, the best thing to do was to get to water, and water was all around them, but they could not have access, not without incurring incredible dangers upon themselves and entering into harm's way. So of all of this space, it is a remarkable thing to think that there were 74 to 100 people under the control of basically 4 to 5 Caucasian people. How is that possible? And one of the questions that people ask us so often is, why didn't they rise up and escape? How? When the only way slavery works is through violence, terror, intimidation, and the threat of death. And you don't have to be beaten every day to know the fear and the horror of physical punishment. A family only needed to be told one time, I'll sell your children. And then that in turn would force a type of behavior that would squash those thoughts. So while we're looking at this space and thinking, well, surely there were opportunities to escape, no, it wasn't nearly that easy. And the psychological component is what we have to wrestle with today. McLeod today is now 37 acres. If you see the light blue swatch there, actually it's kind of a dark blue, that is all that remains of McLeod Plantation today. So when you come on a tour, we don't walk all of those 37 acres, but we get close.
Toby, what's in the little cutout on the right?
Yeah, right on the
That, exactly, that is a water filtration system that was never originally a part of the property. And it looks very strange. And we wonder, why didn't they just take the line there? So there was something there before that prohibited that, but we don't know what that is. We've not been able to identify what it was prior.
Mhm.
What questions before we move on?
I just, on that corridor that you were showing, there was a plantation that I visited around Jacksonville, Florida. I can't remember the name of it, where the slave owner actually married one of the slave women. So then it was an interracial marriage. They had children. He eventually moved to the Caribbean, I think, because the laws were getting stricter and stricter, prohibiting interracial. Do you remember the name? You're familiar with that plantation?
Actually, only vaguely, and I don't remember the name, but I do remember hearing the story.
Yeah.
It is an interesting thing to think about too. There were, as this very dear friend of mine said, there may have been segregation during the day, but there was sexual integration at night. So I know we're in a church, we're going to be respectful, but there was a lot of that going on, and the impact continues to weigh on America today in the form of something called colorism. And hopefully we'll have time to get into that a little bit. Thank you for adding that. I want you to take a look at these three gentlemen. William Wallace McLeod, furthest to the left, was the original owner of McLeod Plantation. The McLeods were from Scotland. Has anyone been to Inverness in your travel? Oh, wow. Okay. All right. We hit one there. All right. That's where they were from. And they, their original ancestor that we can trace was sent to Edisto as a prisoner of war. And so he settled in Edisto, which is about 30 miles or so outside of Charleston, 30, 45. That's where they began initially raising cotton, producing cotton. This man, William Wallace on the far left, was a little bit jealous of his older brothers because he wasn't going to get the land. He wasn't the oldest son. So he left Edisto and moved to Charleston about 1848. He would marry a lady named Susan Lawton, and the Lawtons had money to burn. Do you remember that old English word back in the day when you married a lady, you got access to something?
Dowry.
Susan's dowry would enable the purchase of the 1,700 acres that we just looked at. And so William Wallace McLeod Sr. had every intention of rising up the ranks in Charleston. He served in our state house in Columbia. And when his first wife, Susan, died, he married again, which was common back in the day, less than a year later. That wife, Martha Royal, died. And it was her death that we believe spurred him to go join the, what we would call, then they were called the Charleston Light Dragoons, and they would subsequently be absorbed into the Confederate Army. But he was so grief-stricken that we do believe that sort of hindered his ability to kind of come back to life and deal with his children. By the time the Civil War really embraced and encroached around McLeod, the year was about 1862. And this man, William Wallace, was off doing small excursions. He knew the war was getting bad, and planters were told, get off of James Island. We can't protect you anymore. So he sent his children to the upstate. One of those children is this man in the middle, William Wallace McLeod Sr. He grew up actually in Greenwood, South Carolina. He and his two sisters were not on the property during the war. They would come back after the war. So this man in the middle, William Wallace, then would come back after the war, take the family forward and move them into the 20th century. This man sitting next to him is his son, William Ellis McLeod. And you notice William Ellis lived to be nearly 105. He died in January of 1990. So remember I said to you at the beginning, these things are controlled by families. And this was the intent with the McLeods. Now, another interesting piece, because we're constantly learning things. William Wallace McLeod Sr. had a daughter named Annie. Annie outlived everybody in her generation. She died in the 1930s. She married a man named Frampton. The Framptons have living descendants. They're about into the great, great, greats at this point. And I'm getting one step closer to being able to have a conversation with them about their family and their life and their times. So hopefully I'll have some updated info whenever we meet again to share with you about who these people are. They still live in Charleston and they keep a very low profile, and they want absolutely nothing to do publicly with their family's legacy, which I find very, very interesting. So when you look at these three men, what you see here is a real key foundation into why McLeod is still remembered. The third McLeod is considered the last great planter in the area. And the legacy of what they left feeds directly into what we now know is what's called the lost cause. And the McLeods had a very pivotal role in fostering those ideas and attitudes. They were very much into history, very much into education, banking, finance. There was no area of Charleston that these folks did not have a hand in. And there are repercussions of that to this very day. The last McLeod male, let me tell you this, did not marry. William Ellis McLeod. We can't find a girlfriend, lady friend, fiance, chick on the side, boo thing, nothing. All we know about are 50 cats on the back porch that he spent time with, which might explain why he didn't have. So we keep wondering, why didn't he continue the family line? And there's a manuscript that's being published with his direct words in it, in which he regrets never having had children. So it's a very interesting turn of events because he actually broke the line with not reproducing. So when we think about them, it is because of these three and the legacy that they would leave.
And why did he change the spelling of the name?
Actually, that is a human Toby typo. That is a human Toby typo. I didn't catch that. Thank you. I will fix that. Next.
Ryan.
This picture, which I wish was bigger, I was trying to find something a little grander, just on a small scale, shows you what the house looked like before the renovations that took place in the 1920s. There's another picture at the end that's going to show you sort of the grandeur of the front of the house. But this picture is critical because what it allows us to do is to show the progression of how it went from just a plain farmhouse into an antebellum home, which is not what the McLeods lived in. They took the time to take the property back to what their grandfather lived in because they were trying to continue his legacy of grandeur. This picture is the man in the middle. This is William Ellis Jr., and this would be about a year or two before he would pass away.
Yeah.
This, if I could make this a little larger, what the McLeods did, interestingly enough, was they renovated the house and they opened up the property for tours, which in many ways is reprehensible because there were still enslaved people living, formerly enslaved people living on the property. So what they began to do was have these scenic Sunday afternoon tours. And if you take a look at this, they've got this laid out here. At the very bottom, it says M.W. McLeod. That's Mina. That was one of Willie's sisters. She was the orchestrator of these tours. It's right near the country club. When you come to Charleston, I will point out to you where that country club is. The country club used to be McLeod territory, and it's right on Folly Road. So if you notice where it says historic interest, look what they're selling. Headquarters of the Confederate and the federal forces, respectively, during what? The war between the states. They still cannot say Civil War. And then later, the headquarters of the Freedmen's Bureau and twice escaped fire. We have no record of that. And the big house and Negro cabins are still preserved with human beings living in them. So I will say this about them. They were right about the future of Charleston, because this is why people come to Charleston. And if you think about it, right around the time of Birth of a Nation, I don't know if any of y'all have seen that, some of y'all may have, Gone with the Wind, all of that was happening right about the time that the McLeods were redoing the house. So were they tapping into what we now call a trend? Yes. Did they have any idea what it would do for Charleston? I don't see how in the world they could possibly know that 100 years later, this is what people come to Charleston for, which is why, if I can be candid, people come and try to beat us up because they want the Gone with the Wind. They want the fantasy, they want the mint juleps, but they don't want to hear about the humanity of people who were living in those cabins. Next. This is another flyer that we have found. I do want to point out the Society for the Preservation of Old Dwellings is now the Historic Charleston Society. It's got a very different name, but it's very akin to that. So Saturday afternoon or Sunday afternoon, if you were someone with money, this is what you did. You went and you toured these old houses. And what's fascinating to us is the way that they're all laid out. And at the very bottom, it says, and this is a little hard to read, the same tour was repeated in March 1937, except they didn't go to Angel Oak. And if you all come to Charleston, please go and see that tree. It is absolutely stunning. They skipped Angel Oak, but they served tea at the McLeod house. So it's very interesting to us that the McLeods were still trying to be the center of Charleston high life. That was very, very important to them. I wanted y'all to see this. This is actually upstairs on the second floor. And I have to tell you, there's a sign that says this area is closed. The upstairs is closed because my colleagues and I sit up there. It's for our protection and safety. And every week we have to shoo people back down because they're just demanding their right to go up there. But this sign has been in the house since the Civil War. The problem is we don't know which side used it. Was it the Confederate side or was it the Union side? Because both, it says Adjutant General's Office, and there's a finger pointing in that direction, pointing to the right. The door immediately behind it, that is a restroom that was renovated. But this sign, the fact that it's still there is very, very remarkable to us. And it speaks to the duplicity of what was going on at that time and the historic nature to have both sides of the war in one house is remarkable. We're shifting here a little bit. This is the beginning of what we call the Slave Street or Slave Row, which was the heart of the community. There were about 74 to 100 enslaved people, and I'm convinced that there were more, who lived at McLeod. And so these homes that you see date back to between roughly 1750 up to 1850. These are the originals. And we know that between 10 to 12 to 15 to 20 people would live in these small spaces, 12 by 20. Sometimes they were all family, sometimes they were not, which lent itself to a whole other multitude of issues. And this is one side of the street. On the other side of these trees was another row of houses. So there were 23 of them all together. What we're trying to determine is what happened to the rest of them. Did they burn down? Did they sell them? How much did the Great Migration have to do with it? Because as some of you may know, those of you familiar with that period, so many people left the South. And it could well be that there was no more need for these homes anymore. So we're trying to find some documentation that speaks to that issue. I wanted y'all to see this a little bit, and I'm gonna make it a little bit larger if I can. I wanted to talk for just a minute about the people who actually live there. And you'll see some names, Pompey Hard Times Dawson and the Dawson family, the Delaney family. And let me say to you, I have met the descendants of the Dawsons. I have met the descendants of the Delaneys. I'm trying to find the Gethers family. There is a possibility that yours truly may be a descendant of these Haywards. And it's one of the reasons that McLeod haunts me so, because I have done everything I can to close the circle with respect to my family. And there's no one who's 100 years old or older now who can tell me what I need to know. So every day I go to that property and I look at these names and I wonder, is it possible that I came from one of them? The Pinckney family, Isabella Pinckney is a mulatto woman. We don't use that word now, family. Now we say biracial. She lived up in the attic. And because she was up there, she was the subject of rape and sexual assault, as were all women and children. She had a son. His name is there on the side, Daniel. And Daniel's story is so compelling because there are two sides. One side of the family says that he was lynched because he was involved with white women and they didn't know his history. The other side says that he passed completely into white society, went to college, went to medical school, and became a doctor. Now, you remember I mentioned this term colorism. Are y'all familiar with that? What does that mean? Does it have any recognition at all?
Yes.
To some of us, yes, not all of us.
Okay, tell me what you know about it.
The shades. Yeah, the lighter, the better. Yeah.
Exactly. For so long, that was thought to be the way you made it in America, was if you were a light-skinned Black person, you had a better shot at success. And so I want to recommend a couple of resources. How many of y'all have Netflix? All right. There is a movie on Netflix right now called Passing, Passing. Has anybody seen it?
Heard of it, yeah. Heard of it, yeah.
Please watch it. And that may be a Sunday dinner thing you do together. It is profound in scope, because it features a woman who is passing and longs to go back to her Black roots and what happened when she tries to do that. So I would recommend that. One of the actors by the name of Ruth Negga, Negga, has been nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. The other film that I talk about so often is Imitation of Life. Who has seen that? I don't see any hands. Please watch that. Okay, there are two versions. There's the colorized and there's the black and white. Watch the colorized, the one with Lana Turner, because it's just stunning, really. And it speaks to what happens to children who are in between two worlds. I highly, highly recommend that. And then there is a book called The Vanishing Half, which also speaks to what it is to be between worlds. And I'll tell you something, this issue is the one that oh, you're reading now. Awesome. Please keep everybody up to date, because I've heard it's incredible. I've gotten to it yet, but it's on my list.
Sarah.
That's awesome. That is awesome. This issue has just literally breaks people. When I tell the story of the woman who came up to me on a tour in the middle of the tour and told me that she had been passing as white for 20 years. And she was there with friends who did not know who she was, and she couldn't tell them. The way young people just give into the tears that they feel about being from an interracial marriage and nobody understands what they're going through. I can't tell y'all how many grandparents bring their kids to McLeod and pull me aside at the end and say, how do I talk to my kids about this? I cut my daughter off because she had a baby with a Black man, but I have this brown child now and I don't know what to do. This thing is so real and so powerful. So the way to heal is to talk about it and to address it and to look at the continuing impact of colorism. So those are just three sources that we recommend. I am so determined to find out what happened to Daniel McLeod. I want to know what happened to the rest of his story. The Rivers family, several of them are buried across the street at McLeod. As of yet, I have not met any of the Robinsons yet, but I'm continuing to look for them. On the next page, we got Amelia Smith. I've got to just tell you about her briefly. She is connected to the Delaney's. Could we go back real quick? She is connected to the Delaney family, and they came to McLeod last year. There they are. Thank you. And they had an amazing tour of the property, and then they left. About 15 minutes after they left, I went back to my computer and I tried one more time to find Amelia, and it must have been a God thing because there she popped up, her death certificate in the city of Charleston. She died in 1874. So I got on the phone and I called them in the car and I said, "You won't believe this, I found Amelia." And the whole car just went quiet and I could hear people crying, and all they wanted to know was, did she make it to freedom? And she did, and plus some. So when I think about Amelia, I think about finding her in 1874. The next group of people, the next 9, actually self-emancipated from McLeod in 1862. They left with a man named William Dawson. What we're trying to figure out is, did they go by water or did they go by land? William Dawson joined the Navy, served 2 tours of duty, and may have been one of the first Black Marines ever. We're trying to find his pension records now to determine that. And then there was a little girl that went on that trip, a child. Actually, I don't know if it was a boy or girl named Rose was the mother. And what I wonder is, what happened to her? One woman, a small baby, and you're escaping. And we can find no record of her in any way. So these are just some of the stories of the people who lived at McLeod. And I know that there are many, many others. And I'm hoping one day soon that my colleagues and I are going to be able to put a book together so that we can remember them and keep their memories going forward. Let me add one other thing about the Dawsons. William Dawson had 3 wives. His first wife, Charity, died. His second wife, Hetty, died in 1886. Y'all may know that Charleston had a massive earthquake in 1886 called the Great Shake. Hetty died in that. Then he married a lady named Annie and had 5 more children. Annie would go on to work at the old cigar factory. The cigar factory is an incredible site of resistance because in the 40s, the workers actually went on strike. They tried to unionize to request a raise of 25 cents more. Out of that protest would come a song called "We Shall Overcome." All that, yes, it is an incredible, incredible story. So when you come to Charleston, please make sure you go to the old cigar factory and relive that story. What questions before we go on? All right, let's keep going. This lovely lady is Miss Maddie Richardson. Miss Richardson is the granddaughter of a little girl named Leah. Leah was bought by William Wallace McLeod in 1856. And we think that he bought her because his wife, Susan, was very, very ill. And the children basically, and I hate these words, but I need to say them, they needed somebody to play with. So she was like not a playmate. We can't put 21st century parlance. She was their pet. She slept on the floor. She ate whatever they gave her. She wore whatever they put on her. But Leah would survive. And she would live her entire life at McLeod. She died in the 1930s, but she lived long enough to see this lady, Miss Richardson. And Miss Richardson, in turn, lived long enough to see Barack Obama become elected and re-elected president of the United States. So when we talk about things moving forward, there's no greater evidence than what happened in the Richardson family. There are still hundreds of Richardsons on James Island today. Miss Maddie left us in 2012. She was 97, and we have met her fifth and sixth generation grandchildren who come to McLeod and share their stories with us. This lady is Miss Harriet Forrest. And this photo means the world to us because it is the only view we have of inside a cabin. And we don't see a lot, but there she is enjoying her stogie. Miss is the singular distinction of being the last formerly enslaved person to live at McLeod. She died in 1938. Her husband, Stephen, was left there during the Civil War to hold things down, if you will, while William Wallace went off to fight the war. Miss Forrest has a great-great-granddaughter who lives 3 miles away. Her name is Carrie, and she is a wonderful friend to McLeod and helps us keep this story intact. This man, I want y'all to know, is a man by the name of Martin F. Becker. I often call him the most famous man no one's ever heard of. Martin Becker was from his mother was from East Guyana. His father was from South Africa. He grew up a free man, went to school in Europe, trying to track down his records. And so he petitioned this country, what would become our country, for citizenship in the 1840s, was granted citizenship, and would go on to live in Massachusetts, got married, served as an abolitionist assistant, if you will, got involved with the Underground Railroad. Then he joined the Navy, survived being on the US Cumberland, which I believe sank. And if that wasn't enough, then he joined the Massachusetts 55th, came to Charleston and served, eventually getting all the way up to second lieutenant, which was absolutely unheard of at the time. Martin Becker's children moved to Rhode Island. One of them set up a school of music and a school of penmanship. And then the third generation went on to do amazing things out west. In fact, his great-great-granddaughter was the first Black woman ever admitted to the Daughters of Revolution. His fourth generation is still out in California, and they want absolutely nothing to do with him or his legacy or us. And I tell you, it just hurts so much because what he did was remarkable, all that he accomplished. And very few people know this other than the Pittsburgh Historical Society, which worked with us to uncover a lot of this. But it also speaks to what happens to families. Martin Becker left his family in Massachusetts, came to South Carolina, and had another family. And those two families have not been able to come together. And I think that that's part of the reason that this second great generation doesn't want anything to do with him. But I'm not done with this, because I'm going to go back to them with an appeal. Please let me tell you what we've uncovered, because my hope in my heart is that maybe we can help those families get together and honor his extraordinary legacy, which is an amazing book. This man's life is a mini series. So we're pulling all the data together, and we're going to try to cover him in a social media post for Black History Month. Martin F. Becker. This is why we call him the Renaissance Man. He actually lived on the second floor at McLeod and served as the quartermaster during the war. This beautiful little girl. I can't tell y'all how many times I have walked down Slave Road. So we're still on Slave Road. If you can imagine with me, we're walking toward Folly Road, and there is this cistern in the middle. And I have a picture of this little girl. This is what you're looking at. And so many times I have stood at that well and said, Lord, please let me find her. Please let her be alive. I just want to hear her story. How about 30 days ago, we found this little girl.
Oh, wow.
She is alive. She is in her 70s. Her mother is still alive. So as soon as I get the word through back channels that I can go visit them, I am hauling my cookies to Somerville with the recorder and talk to this family, because I want to know, how in the world did they survive at McLeod, and how did they get there? She and her 8 sisters and 1 brothers lived in that cabin behind her. And the water, this story hurts, but I want to share it with you. William Ellis, the last McLeod male, the man on the far right in the pictures, would not allow Black people to come to the house for water. So they had to take their buckets whenever this handle broke. You see that handle in her hand? When that broke, they had to take their buckets and walk all the way to the Country Club of Charleston to ask for water. And I share this because people often say, well, did they ever change? Is there any evidence of any change? Change what? This is who they were. And so for us to try to make them into something different robs the dignity of folks who survived what happened to them there. So her name, by the way, is Lucy. And I am so looking forward to getting to see Lucy, hopefully within the next month or 2. If we go further on the other side of the kitchen, this is what the washroom would have looked like. I've got to be careful not to call it the laundry. That's 21st century. The washing of clothes was a big deal, typically done every Monday. Very large pots were used to boil the water. And the downside to this is so many enslaved children would fall into the fire and be burned. We have a story of one of the McLeod wives tending to children who had been burned in those pots of extremely hot water. And of course, then the clothes would be hung out on the clothesline to dry. So that was a typical Monday experience. But if you can envision, on the other side of that is the kitchen, and that's where all of the food was served. And it was in very close proximity to the house.
It's a different building than the house?
Yeah.
It is. It is a different building. What would happen is, because of the fear of fire, the kitchens were put outside, because if the kitchen went, everything would go.
Okay.
This is cabin number 9, the interior. And the family that lived here, there was a little girl here by the name of Miss Robercina Gethers. When Miss Gethers left here as a teenager, she swore she would never, ever set foot on McLeod again. But how many times did we say we're never, ever going to do a thing? Right? And she would come back in her 70s, ironically enough, as a nurse to take care of the now aging William Ellis. And he remembered that her family had been enslaved at McLeod, so he rented 3 cabins to her. Number 9, she turned into a church. And you can't see it clearly here, it's fading away, but there's stenciling on the wall. She wrote her favorite scriptures, and she held church services in here weekly. We are in the process now of stabilizing this cabin, and we're trying to make it look like what it looked like when she lived there. So when you walk in, if you look to the right, you'll see the church. And if you look to the left, you'll see what it looked like in her life and times. And we're just so honored that we are now finally to this point to stabilize this. Mrs. Gethers just passed away last year, actually 2020. So we did not have an opportunity to sit at her feet and talk to her, which we really regret. But we invited her brother to come and visit us at McLeod. And ironically, the very day that he came to visit us would have been his baby sister's 71st birthday. They had buried her behind the house, and he remembered that. So we placed flowers there in her honor. So I feel like Miss Robercina left, but the good Lord sent her brother to walk the rest of this way with us. This cabin had a fire. You can see, if you look on the ground, you see the shoes. that were burned there. For a long time, we thought that this was done as an arson attempt to scare the family. What we've learned recently is this cabin was burned as an arson in protest of the civil rights movement. So the fire of what we thought was the 50s now actually comes closer to the 60s. And it's unnerving to think that people would come on the property and do this. We do know that no one was lost, no one was harmed as a result, but this cabin still stands as a shell and a reminder of the hatred of that time. I wanted y'all to see Cutbridge Elementary, which was actually the very first school that the formerly enslaved children went to. It was 3 miles away. They had to walk through the swamp, but they made it. And in the place that exists now is a school called Montessori Elementary. It's Murray Lassane. And there is a beautiful painting that is a reminder of how critical it was to get education. Education was the key. It was absolutely the key. So those first kids who started going to school in 1865, 1866, 1867, would then 20 years later become the first teachers at Avery in Charleston and be the first professionals to go out into the world after slavery. So in little small schoolhouses like this, our country would be shaped and changed. And we always want to honor Cutbridge Elementary. Oh boy, this is the Sankofa Memorial. This is literally across the street. When you come to McLeod, you go through the crosswalk. Now you can't go back in there. I went back in there to get these pictures because I wanted you to see the condition. It's not good. And we're getting ready to address that. This marker in the middle, it has a name that says Ellen Foxcraft. Miss Foxcraft died in 1847, and we are trying to find out why is she buried back there? Because you know from history, typically, white and Black folks were not buried together. Even in death, there is separation. What we suspect, our working supposition, is that she was a governess to one of the previous owners and she took sick and died and they buried her there. We are 99% certain this is a white woman because there are too many letters on this tombstone, this headstone. That means money. She would have been able, someone afforded this for her. So it gives us a little bit of information to go on. I have found tons of Ellen Foxcrafts in Ancestry, but the dates just don't line up. So I'm going to keep looking for her. And Mr. Rivers on the right died as late as 1949. And you know, I put this note here, that space was used from 1776 all the way up to 1965, making it one of the longest used spaces in the area. One of the things that I'm so grateful for is we're getting ready to go find the descendants so that we can pull them together and ask them, what do you want this cemetery to look like? Because we should not do anything without the descendants. But on a larger scale, some of you may be aware that the conditions of Black burial spaces is now the stuff of national policy. So I'm hoping that McLeod will be one of the places where those voices can be heard and honored in such a unique way. This brings us to the lessons. Now, first of all, I want to slide over here. Do y'all see the house? This is actually the front. The other side, which you might think is the back, is actually the back. This is the true front of the house, but the back was made to look like the front so that when people would drive by, they would get a picture of an antebellum home. So when you come to McLeod, we'll go around the sides and we'll do our tour. The second floor, those are the bedrooms. This is where my colleagues and I work, where we don't want people coming up the stairs, but they do anyway. And then this front porch is an interesting thing. People would sit there and watch the enslaved out in the fields. So what you can't see here is if you're looking directly out are the cotton fields. So it is a difficult picture of life on one hand, and the realities and the rigors of life on the other hand. And when we look at the lessons, and I've tried so hard to focus on how do we bring healing out of this? How do we reconcile the fact that in this pretty space, men, women, and children were raped and beaten and tortured and ripped apart and dehumanized in ways that our minds still can't fathom? How do we rest with that? How do we find good and kindness and love in each other? How do we deal with the revelations of slavery? And how do we get inspiration to keep loving our neighbors? Where is the understanding to come from if you are going to deny my heritage in favor of yours? How do we gain appreciation from these lessons and from each other? And where is the humility in the nation that can't honor the lessons of the past? What is our purpose even in our time together tonight? And the word destiny, I rest on it so much because I know in my heart I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. And that all of my soon to be 59 years, I'll be 59 on Thursday, has led me to this moment. I have no doubt around that, and to tell those stories. But I also hope that there will be harmony for our nation and an understanding that God has given us this thing together, and that we do foster forgiveness. And then we come to figure out what American culture is and see each other as a unique part of that contribution. What questions or comments do you have?
Toby, when were most of the enslaved people freed? Was it after the Civil War or?
1865, it was the war that freed them. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free them. It was the war. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And then did most of them leave and go to other areas, or they just left the plantation?
Well, it's a combination of things. Some of them left after the war. Some of them stayed after the war. And then others continued to try to self-emancipate. And this is where that list of 74 gets interesting for us, because we don't know who may have come back after the fact that wasn't on that list to begin with. How did those names get added? Where did they come from? We're still trying to determine, was it the second Willie or the third Willie? So there's so many missing pieces. I tell you, I would give anything to have Willie number 2's journal, because that would answer a multitude of questions, but we don't have it.
Well, we say more about what you said a few minutes ago. It wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation, it was the war that freed them. Can we unpack that a little bit more for us?
Yes, the emancipation occurred in February, I think it was February, Google me on that, 1863.
Right.
And the provisions for that would allow certain types of people to gain their freedom immediately. That
Right.
was not the case at McLeod. So at that point too, there were people had already dispersed because of that evacuation order that was issued in 1862. Let me go back to that. There was a general named States Rights Gist who told the planters, get off this island, we can't protect you. So what many of them did was took their enslaved with them to another part of the state. So therefore, they were away from home, the home that they knew, and they were being enslaved and working elsewhere. Some of those people came back and stayed the rest of that time. And that's how they would gain their freedom when the Union troops, I believe it was the 55th, came through Charleston. You remember that famous photo in Harper's Weekly of the Union troops coming through Charleston? Those people dancing around the streets were formerly enslaved, now freed people who welcomed those Union troops. Some of those folks in that picture, we believe, were from McLeod. What I can't tell you definitively is how many who had been there before say at the beginning of William Wallace's time, 1850, were there 1865. That's what I can't definitively break down.
Sure.
Not without the oral history, newspapers. You know what's been another interesting source to us is the ads for runaways,
Mhm.
because people were determined not to lose their property. And those ads, because they were put in newspapers, are dated. So it gives us more of a calendar to say this person was there, this person was not.
Got it.
So it is challenging to put those pieces in there. Supposition gets us only so far, and we always cautious about how much we're theorizing because we don't want to throw it too far to the other side. Something else could have happened that we haven't even considered,
Sure.
and we've leave the door open for that.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? I'm tuning in virtually. Um, so I have a question. How often do you interact with descendants of the slave owners? Like, do they tell you, that they want to ever, is there any other societies that kind of look into descendants of people who were owning slaves?
That's a great question. So at the beginning, I talked a little bit about the descendants of the McLeods, they're Framptons, and I'm getting close. I'm getting close. I have a lead. I have a back channel lead, and she's trying to get me connected to them because I would like to sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk to them. But I understand that they don't want any public recognition from this at all. So it may have to be a very private thing. And that's as close as I've gotten on that side. Having said that, there was a book written maybe about 15, 20 years ago called Slaves in the Family by a man named Edward Ball. Edward Ball brought together, I think it was like the 4,000 descendants of his original slave owning ancestors. And he has now formed a group called the Committee of the Descendants, I believe. Don't quote me exactly on that name, where he ensures that they are continuously in touch with each other, which is really remarkable because it is such a difficult and dicey subject to think about you sitting down and breaking bread with someone who could have potentially sexually assaulted an ancestor, and that's why you're sitting here today. That's some heavy stuff. And so there is a fear around confronting all of the emotions that would come from that. But yet, as we look at these lessons, there's something to be gained by sitting down and talking as well. So we keep the door open. One of the things that we make very clear at McLeod is everybody is welcome, all ideas and attitudes, because once you start shutting things down, you shut people down, and we don't want to do that. We understand how difficult this is. And I can tell you from the stories that people have brought to me and told me, it gets right to the heart of who we are. And so we always are looking to talk to people who are willing to talk to us.
So you said that this plantation opened in about 2015? And
That
how did it come to
Yeah.
you, and who was, who was owning it, and whose decision was it to take this approach with it, to tell the story of who's telling it?
So McLeod Plantation has been in existence since 2015, you're correct. When William Ellis McLeod, the last McLeod male, died in 1990, he had left a third of his estate to a local nonprofit, a historical nonprofit. That nonprofit then bought out his sisters, his two sisters, so they have clear title. So they held on to it for about 20 years with lots of fits and starts as to what to do with it, because they really didn't know, and they didn't have the community support to proceed in turning it into a resort area. So what happened was they sold it a couple of times to different entities. Those entities also could not make a go of McLeod. So it ended up back at that same historical organization. In 2011, Charleston County Parks and Rec made the decision to tell the story of McLeod. They purchased it, and from the beginning, their intent was to tell the story of the enslaved, not to do the typical thing and tell the story of the enslaver. So all of the process was geared around integrity, building the interpretation, getting the interpretive process credentialed, taking care of the collection that came with the house. It was always the intent from day one to do what is being done now. And they have really done a remarkable, and I might add, courageous job at seeing it through. We couldn't do this without the leadership at the top.
Yeah.
What condition was the house in when you got it, when they got it? Excuse me.
I wasn't there, but I understand it was bad.
Because that's 1990 to 2011 is.
Yeah.
It was in it was in bad shape, in part because Willie was in bad shape. At that point, he was like a month away from his 105th birthday. Things had just really deteriorated. It was unhygienic, just a whole multitude of things.
That was the
So-
cats.
Say that again?
I said the cats, plus the cats.
Exactly. So it just was a process of both trying to salvage what they could. Now, compounding this was after he died, a number of caretakers lived there and things just got taken from the property. People took things, no one knew what it was a mess. So it was a while before anybody went in and sort of established control over that space. And by the time that happened, a number of years had gone by. There are things that we're not going to recover. Interestingly enough, though, the last 7 years of his life, Willie made friends with a local doctor, actually a dentist, and this man sort of became a surrogate son, and he walked the fields of McLeod, walked through the house, walked the fields, and collected as many as 10,000 artifacts. Those artifacts are still in his possession, and we are in the very gentle, delicate negotiating phase of asking, can we have those things back? Because historically, they belong in the house. They belong with the house. But, it's sensitive. And so I'm hoping that we'll be able to get some of those things and we'll be able to display them, and they'll be where they belong for the historical nature of the house.
Toby, Terry McIntyre, Jackie's husband, and when we were with you, if you recall, there was one other woman who left early and then we stayed. Somebody from inside the house came out and we talked until you had to unlock a gate so we could walk down and see the river. I am so struck by the series of words there because it just made me think of one of my all-time heroes, Archbishop Desmond Tutu,
Mm-hmm.
after the horrors of apartheid said, no, we're going to have these reconciliation and truth meetings.
Yes.
And we are going to come together. And those words, reconciliation is at the top of your list.
Yes. And didn't we just lose? We just lost Bishop Tutu, right?
Yes.
I loved him. I loved who he was. I remember, and some of you do as well, sitting and watching those hearings. I remember them on BBC World Service. I think they aired them around the clock. They were devastating. The horrors of what had been done and what people had endured. And Bishop Tutu himself broke down on many occasions and shared the grief of a country. And so what that did to me was it said to the world, it matters what happens. We cannot just overlook it and move on. As people sometimes scream at me, why can't you people just forget it? Just move on. No, I cannot get over my family. When you get over your family, I'll get over mine. It doesn't work that way. And so I think we are stronger as a people when we see our humanity in each other. And I think that's one of the greatest lessons of those hearings, one of the greatest things that Bishop Tutu gave us. We've got to see ourselves in the struggle of others. And I see this often when our Native American family comes to McLeod. And they're so crushed because their heritage has been wiped out. They can't go anywhere and find any part of themselves. When our Jewish family comes, I can't tell you how many times they just sit on the bench and just sob. And sometimes we can help. Sometimes we sit and just hold them in our arms. Sometimes we just sit and hold hands. No words need to be said. We just need to feel what is being experienced. And so those things, if people can let themselves be that vulnerable, but now listen, that's scary. It is really scary and it's tough and you're in a public place, but I do think that McLeod absorbs the tears so well. And I always hope that when people come, they can leave some of that grief and pain there. Leave it there and go back out into the world and make change. That's what I hope, that we can be a change agent and a place of healing through reconciling ourselves to the horrors of what happened. Because those horrors have helped shape what we have become as Americans.
Wow. Yeah. Oh,
Preach.
yeah.
So you know, we're going to continue the discussion in a couple of weeks on the 20th. And Toby is going to talk more about the experience of the enslaved peoples after the war, right?
Yes.
So we'll get to hear more about that experience, because even though they were technically freed after the war, their life was still not wonderful. And there are a lot of lessons to learn from that period as well.
That too is the period that gets us into so much trouble because, and I know you all are aware of the current rage through the country about CRT and the whole shebang, and people are screaming, well, you're teaching. No, we're just telling you what happened at McLeod. Let's stay right there. And with real life, vetted, documented stories of what happened. It is unnerving, I have to tell you, because for those of you who haven't been, we're out there amongst these 37 acres, we're very vulnerable. And so we've got to be cautious about the crowd. If people are really agitated, we're calling each other in a secret way to say, listen, come walk by. I may need some backup. We're very careful because we don't take for granted how upset the nation is. In checking the pulse of the country, we've got some angry people in a lot of different directions for a lot of different reasons. And we've got to be mindful about that. But I do believe when God sends you out on a mission, he equips you. And there's always people in the group who are watching over you and making sure you're okay and praying for you. I can't tell you how many people who come up to me just, can I just lay hands on you? Can I just pray for you? And I said, Lord, thank you. Because I know you're watching over us. I just feel that so strongly. But we are in a dangerous time in our country. And I'm hoping that we can be for the peace and we can be for each other and share that. Because I think that those types of efforts make change. Things are happening at levels in this country. We just don't see it. You all are a prime example. You all are a prime example. And so if what you are doing can be done in neighborhoods throughout this country, what can we become? What could we become? But it starts with one small step. And so I'm just so honored that y'all would come out. What is it? 18 minus there and y'all are there. You made it.
No, it's better today. Yeah. It's cool, but it's better.
But y'all made that speaks volumes. I only wish I could be there with you. I love Chi-Town, so maybe on the next go round we'll get. But in the meantime,
We'll have you speak in person.
I would love. Or all of y'all get on a bus and come to Charleston.
Or a plane.
A plane, yes, a plane where people are behaving with some common sense. Let's verify. But I will be ready on the 20th, and I'm going to pick up with from Reconstruction on, all the way from let's say 1865, 66, all the way up to 1990. because there are some definitive threads of things that should have happened and didn't. And there are threads of things that happened and made a lot of difference. And I'd like y'all to have both sides of that. And if there's anything else in the interim, please let me know.
Okay.
Toby,
Thank
before you leave, can we pray for you, please?
Oh, I will. Yes, thank you.
Lord Jesus, we thank you for the words that you have helped us to hear tonight. And we thank you for Toby and her witness in your name, not only here in this conversation, but throughout all the things that you are leading her to be responsible for and responsive to. We ask for your protection for her and for her colleagues. We ask that you would help to open eyes and open ears and open hearts, that truly we can be real, seeing one another, hearing one another, and seeing you in each of us.
Yes.
Seeing your image, seeing your face, seeing your heart leads us to reconcile one to another and to you. So as we go into this world tonight and in the week ahead, may it be as your people filled with your love and your peace and your justice. We ask that in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Thank you.
Amen.